Well, joining us now is MP Bob Seeley, former member of the Defence Select Committee. Hi, Bob. Thanks for coming on the show. Listening to the extremely strong words of Benjamin Netanyahu and essentially framing this now as a religious war, a holy war, do you think there is any chance whatsoever of there ever being a two-state solution?
Not at the moment. I don't think he's framing it as a holy war. I think he's framing it as a moral war. And there is a little bit of a difference in that. I think people are getting confused between obeying the rules of war and ceasefires. I don't see there's any reason for a ceasefire, because if you have a ceasefire, all it will do is allow the Hamas time to rest, to resupply, etc. So in the same way that having a ceasefire in Ukraine would just be helping the Russians, having a ceasefire now is just helping the Hamas. However, that is different from obeying the rules of war, which Israel has to do. And one of the things here is, despite the horrific events which have happened to it, it has to remember proportionality. And there are, whether we like it or not, Hamas hides in and around civilians. Hamas wants civilians to be killed. Hamas wants Israel, Jews, as it would say, to kill Arabs, to kill Muslims, in order to incite the Middle East. So the concern is that Israel, when defending itself, when trying to destroy this repugnant terrorist army in Hamas, if it is doing that at the price of damaging its relations, damaging itself, and creating further potential bloodshed in the Middle East, that could be counterproductive as well as being potentially illegal. So there's a very fine line to be drawn there.
Bob, it just seems to me that the rest of the world, you, me, and all the commentators, all the politicians, all the world leaders calling on Israel to do this, to show restraint, humanitarian concerns. Yeah. We're a debating society in a sort of academic ivory tower. The reality we saw last night, Benjamin Netanyahu in that press conference in Tel Aviv, wherever you stand on this issue, he was mesmerizing. He is on a messianic mission. He said, this is my responsibility. Now, I think a played down factor in this conflict has been Netanyahu himself. You know, he hasn't quite admitted it yet, but his acolytes have. They were caught napping on October the 7th. The Israeli intelligence, usually so efficient, let the nation down. Netanyahu let the nation down. He knows that, and he's going to avenge what happened to his people. You saw last night, we're all going, ceasefire, ceasefire, what about the poor children? He has no intention of ceasing fire whatsoever anytime soon, does he? That's the reality.
Yes, and we know that, but avenging is not necessarily justice, and Israel absolutely has the right to justice.
But he is avenging what happened, isn't he? Let's be honest.
Okay, well, if that's going to happen, then this is going to be a concern. Look, I think the point I'm trying to make is you can avenge, you can get justice, you can try to destroy your avowed enemy, which the Hamas fighters clearly are, especially after what they've done. But if in doing that, you actually create further problems for your country in the years to come, because you prevent the normalization of relationships with other Muslim and Arab nations, and especially Saudi Arabia, that can be counterproductive. We've got to remember, as Netanyahu said, there is a massive Iranian angle here. Iran wants to destroy the normalization of relations with Israel. It's succeeding, and Iran wants Israel to kill as many Palestinians as possible, because it is in Iran's interest that that happens. So Israel has to get justice, but it has to do so in a way that minimizes civilian casualties, both for the reasons of international law, but for crude realpolitik. The more civilians and the more Palestinian women and children die, the more legally and morally problematic the issue becomes, clearly, and the more that Israel plays into Iran's ambitions and aims. There is a related point here, Kev, very briefly. There is an internal political argument, which you may have picked up on in Israel, that Israel and the Netanyahu regime had allowed Hamas pretty much an easy ride because they were too busy focusing on settler issues in the West Bank. That does not excuse anything that Hamas has done. But that is one of the reasons that Israelis, especially people who are opposed to Netanyahu, that is one of the issues that Israelis are currently debating.
Talking about Iran and particularly Tehran's playbook, it seems to me that they're very much winning the info wars here. Social media platforms such as TikTok are absolutely jam-packed with often fake atrocities in short video clips with anti-Semitic propaganda. And it seems to me even at the UN level, a lot of people are buying the narrative of there being a sort of an apartheid state in Israel, without mentioning, of course, hundreds of thousands of Jews who have had to flee neighbouring countries over the years. And so much so that UN spokespeople are quoting Hamas statistics on casualties. With the West backing Israel so clearly on this, how do we make sure that the information we're giving to people, that the information the government is receiving is accurate?
Well, we've just got to try to be accurate and accept the fact that there's going to be an absolute tsunami of offensive, crude, anti-Semitic rubbish being peddled by Egypt throughout the Middle East and the world, and probably also exaggerated and heightened where possible by thousands of Iranian and Russian bots, because they will be stirring the pot on this massively, because it is in their interest to do that, and it's in Iran's interest to do that, and it's in Russia's interest to do that as well, because Iran and Russia are now communicating and acting ever more closely. We know that Russia has been using significant numbers of Iranian drones in its war against the Ukrainian people, and the Iranians need all the technology they can get from the Russians.
Bob, can we move to matters domestic? I don't expect you to have the inside track on this, but I wonder what you make of Keir Starmer's mounting problems over his stance in terms of defending Israel's right to defend itself. He's given a speech this morning saying, which will have disappointed Muslim Labour supporters, saying that he's sticking to his guns. He still defends Israel's right to defend itself. A lot of people want him to call for ceasefire. He won't do that. I personally find that quite impressive. I thought he might cave in. What do you think?
Well, he has. Look, I'm sorry. Maybe you're okay if you're a wiser man than me. What's the difference between a ceasefire and humanitarian?
Yeah, I know. You're right. Linguistics, ridiculous. Yeah.
I mean, he says, I'm going to be a tough guy. And then he says, but we should have a humanitarian pause, otherwise known as a ceasefire. So he's actually calling for a ceasefire without calling for a ceasefire. Look, I think Keir Starmer, I mean, look, just in general, he is someone who is all over the shop, OK? On this issue, again, he's called for a ceasefire without calling for a ceasefire. I get the dynamic in the Labour Party. He is desperate to try to rid himself of the sort of grotesque obscenity of being hauled over the coals over the anti-Semitism in Labour. So he is obviously trying to kick back against that, whilst at the same time keep Muslim MPs on side, some of whom are driven by a very, very obvious and understandable concern about what's happening in Gaza. And there's a fine line that he's having to tread. And I think he's now bending over backwards to support Israel because of the significant anti-Semitic problems. However, when he then says Israel has the right to cut off water, I think he makes a fool of himself. Has he apologized for that? Or do we just pretend he didn't say that? Because that's effectively inciting people to break the laws of war. You cannot cut off water to civilians like Keir Starmer has suggested. It's just a foolish thing to say. And again, to say, I'm against the ceasefire, but let's have a humanitarian pause. I mean, George Orwell will be turning in his grave. This is just sort of an abuse of language.
It is absurd.
Bob, how concerned are you now about the impact this is going to have on communities in this country and safety on our streets? We've seen big pro-Palestine marches taking place over successive weekends, 7 arrests in the last one. Some might say that's almost hopeful, given the numbers who actually turned out for that activism. But with things like Remembrance Day coming up, it will be a particularly sensitive time. Would it be right for the government to move to potentially try and ban these protests, or go as far as unplugging TikTok, which seems to be inciting and provoking a lot of people?
I'm not in favour of banning protests, and unfortunately, people have the right to be idiots. And many of these protesters coming out for the pro-Palestinian stuff are proving their stupidity. I mean, look, I'm getting letters all the time saying, God, what's happening is so offensive. And some of these letters, not all of them, but some of these letters make absolutely no reference to the fact that 1,400 Israelis were slaughtered in absolutely repugnant circumstances. It's a sort of it's sort of this sort of battle for victimhood that we've seen, that sort of where the victims know where the victims. I just, yeah, it's a difficult one. And I'm really against banning things, because I think freedom of speech is important, and I'm afraid part of freedom of speech is the right to say things that other people find offensive. So when people ignore Jewish suffering and Israeli suffering, and some people I think killed by Hamas were Bedouin, there were a small number of Arab Bedouin killed by Hamas as well, so they were actually killing fellow Arabs as well as Jews. I'm wary of trying to silence people, even if they're being offensive and ignorant, as a lot of these people are.
Well, stay with us, Bob, because we'd like to discuss another story with you, which is our talkTV exclusive reporting, which found that the French Coast Guard let 27 migrants drown in the English Channel.
Yeah, the incident happened in French waters in November of 2021 and was the worst disaster in the Channel for 30 years. A report into the tragedy is due to be published in the coming days and will detail how British authorities at the time insisted the incident was well within French waters and should have been dealt with by the French, but the French refused to help.
Well, Bob, this is obviously a major talkTV exclusive, and we stand by the details. It is a true story, which is shocking. These poor migrants got into this flimsy dinghy, made their way across the Channel, didn't get to British waters, got into distress and called for help from the French 15 times. The French essentially said, well, why don't you make your way to British waters? They didn't manage that. They drowned. Now, if the details of this story are true, and it's a talkTV story, so I can tell you it is, I mean, this is an international scandal, isn't it?
It's a very strong, powerful story, and I think it's pretty shameful on the French if this is the case. We shouldn't be letting people drown in the Channel. I mean, I'm afraid to say all of this is just more justification for having stricter immigration controls. And the government's heading in the right direction, and I hope the Rwanda flights get passed by the law courts in the next month or two, and we can actually get on with this, because we've got to deter people from using these routes, because fundamentally they're very dangerous. The answer is not to just allow people in, because you create even more danger and even more death. What you do is you make very clear that if you come in by this route, you enter the country illegally, and that's it. I'm trying to bring in a private members bill in the new year, which is going to be mandating that Parliament votes annually on migration figures and refugee numbers, because until parliamentarians individually own this and explain their actions to their constituents, we are going to continue to have just a great deal of political angst over this issue. This issue, we finalised this, we sought this for the British people, which we need to do when Parliament has an annual vote, when MPs are responsible for themselves for these decisions, and if you come here illegally, then you get sent back, and then you will see the boats dry up. Or the boats.
Ask one question, Bob. A lot of people are asking this. What exactly did Britain get for the £500 million or so we gave to Monsieur Macron? Did he just go and bank it? Because this tragedy is just one story. They were given this enormous amount of money to patrol their own beaches properly, and just as in this case, they stand there and watch the migrants go past on their dinghies and they wave them goodbye. What did we get for our £500 million?
That's a very good question. I'm not 100% sure. Look, I don't want to be sort of give the French a kick for the sake of it. I mean, it may be that they're doing stuff, and it may be that actually the situation would be even worse without us having to fund their police. You would have thought they'd actually want to fund their police in their own country, and make sure that their own rules of law their own laws are obeyed. But if we're having to pay for that, then fair enough. I don't know what we're getting, Kev. It's a great question. My worry is if we stopped giving them money, the situation would become markedly worse. But yeah, we have got to keep shining the light on what the French are doing. We've got to keep pressing them to, frankly, make sure that they obey the laws of their own land. And we've got to make sure that, frankly, we can get a workable solution to the boats through the courts. And once that happens, and I really hope we get the decision from the courts this winter, that we can start the Rwanda flights. And I think at that point, you will probably see a sharp drop off in the amount of illegal migrants coming to the UK. Because if you come here and you've gone all the way through Europe and then you end up in Rwanda, you probably want to stay somewhere else in mainland Europe rather than come to the UK.
I can shine a little light, in fact, on what that £500 million is supposed to be paying for. A detention centre is supposed to be being built in France, doubling their law enforcement to 500. That's this year alone. But up until last year, the government had already sent 300 million to, once again, increase patrols by 40% in 2022. And 55 million was sent in 2021 when this tragic incident in the Channel happened. You compare France to Belgium, who somehow have managed to cut the number of people getting in small boats and crossing the Channel to 944 last year from 12,800 in 2018. And you have to ask yourself, don't you, and especially in the light of this horrible incident that we're learning more about today in the talkTV exclusive, whether actually the French fundamentally lack the will and the resolve to do anything about this. Would that be your perception, Bob?
You know, I fear that you might be right, but I don't want to just sort of, I don't want to necessarily talk about this without having the level of knowledge that's needed. So I worry that they're never doing enough. I'm worried that they're always taking money. I'm worried that if they don't take money, then actually things will get worse again. So the question is, it's an unpleasant situation, but we might be having to pay them to do their own job that they should be paying for to do anyway. And if we don't pay them, they're going to make it even worse. The answer to this, without reversing back all the time to the courts, the answer to this is to get the Rwanda flights going. And then I think interest in coming to this country is going to drop off. And if you're coming to this country illegally, you will eventually, if it is quite clear, if it becomes clear that if you come to this country illegally, you get sent back somewhere, then that is going to be the biggest demotivating factor for coming to this country. But it has to be clear and it has to work. And what we are doing is waiting for the courts to judge on this process whether it is legal. I have no doubt in my own mind it is, but whether the courts find some petty flogging reason to kick it back into the long grass again, let's wait and see. In which case, let's just pull out of the ECHR because we don't need to be a member of it anyway.
Bob, thank you so much. Well, let's hope the policy on paper is more than just a paper aeroplane thrown into a waste bin in Whitehall.
The thing is that people never realise that for Macron to stop the migrants leaving France, that's a vote loser for him.